So I'm going to go ahead and jump into this introductory notebook here, 00_introduction. And this is an introduction to this course, which is Hands-on Introduction to Python from the Center for High Performance Computing, or CHPC, at the University of Utah. My name is Robin Migoch, and this course was written by my colleagues Brett and Wim and myself. I'll mention that solutions to all of the exercises in this notebook are available in the solutions directory. And before you look at any solutions, however, we recommend attempting the exercises yourself because you'll learn best by practicing. So here is our first Python code that we'll run. This is a function, which we'll get into later. And we're going to print out some text to the screen. So if I go ahead and run this, you can see the text. We will use Python and then the text that's in sys.version, which is 3.9.6 in my case. And so we'll get into all of the syntax here as we work through this course. Now, a very important function in Python is help. And if you run help on any Python object, you'll get a description of that object and any methods that it contains, if applicable, which again we'll get into more as we talk about classes, so don't worry too much if that doesn't make sense. Just remember this help text. This help function, when you pass it any Python object, will tell you more about that object. And in this case, it's giving us the text that we've added here, which is called a documentation string. Now we're running Python in what's called a Jupyter notebook. You can see in the top left here I have Jupyter. Jupyter isn't a feature in the base version of Python. It's something we've had to install ourselves or run through service online. But it's a very common way of using Python, so it's important to be familiar with it. Now in a Jupyter notebook, there's a series of cells. One of the cells is active and has a blue bar on the left. So in this case, you can see I have a blue bar on the left here, and this is my active cell. Now this is what's called a modal user interface, and there's two different modes. In command mode, you can move cells around and move between cells. You can see there's keyboard shortcuts for things like saving the notebook, copying, pasting, deleting a cell, things like that, or changing the type of a cell. So by default, a cell is a code cell, which means we'd be typing Python essentially. But you can also have Markdown, which is a formatting language that's like a subset of HTML. It's not a subset, but it renders to HTML, or just plain text. And then the other mode besides command mode is edit mode. And so you can double click a cell to enter edit mode. So if I double click this, you can see this is actually some Markdown, and I have some HTML in here as well. And I can press escape to exit, so I'm no longer typing. If I want to render this, I can press shift enter. And then it's the same key combination for running Python code. So up here, when I ran this, I could either click this run button, or I could press shift enter and it would run the code. So there are two modes in Jupyter Notebooks is the main takeaway here. And if you want to actually edit the content of a cell, you'll want to double click inside of it and then press shift enter to run it. Now the Python language itself is an interpreted language. What this means is you don't have to compile it before running it. There is a Python interpreter which reads the code as it's running, and so there's no intermediate step of creating machine code. You just run the Python interpreter with the script you want to run. Python is an object-oriented language, which means that the data and functions you'd be using in your script are packaged together into objects, and those functions are called methods, which we'll see later. And so in this model, an object's methods are typically used to manipulate that object's data. And these objects are classes. And so we'll talk a lot more about classes toward the end of the course. So this is just a high-level overview. the key takeaway from this object-oriented bullet point is that the code you write, if you use classes, will contain both the data associated with that class and methods that would act on that data. Now, Python is a modular language, so a lot of its functionality is found in modules, which are essentially Python scripts that you can load in other scripts. You'll use the import statement to load these. And Python comes with a lot of modules, and there are many, many more that can be installed by users, such as through the Python package index. So basically anything you'd want to do with a programming language you can accomplish in Python, and it's likely someone has written a module to support it. Now, in Python, leading whitespace or indentation is significant. So the level of the indentation defines the blocks of code. If you're coming from another language like C, you might be familiar with using curly braces to differentiate blocks of code. In Python, there's no such thing. The white space is what determines what a block of code is. And if this doesn't make any sense, don't worry, we'll cover this as we use Python. Now, when you're using indentation or white space in your script, you'll want to use either tabs or spaces. You won't want to use both. That will give you an error. So choose one or the other. The convention is to use 4 spaces for indentation in Python, and some editors will take care of this for you, including the one in Jupyter notebooks. So there are a few different ways to run Python code. You can run it interactively by typing statements at the interpreter. So if I open up a terminal, make this text a little bit bigger, and run Python 3, then I could type Python statements into this interpreter. So that's one way of using it, but most people would use Python in a script where they'd create a file with the extension .py with all of their Python code and then run the interpreter Python, or Python 3 in my case, with the name of that script. And that would tell the Python interpreter, hey, I want to run all of the code that's in this script. Now, it's also possible to make an executable script, which is essentially the same thing, but you tell the system where the interpreter lives, where the interpreter resides, at the top of the script. So that's essentially telling it where to find this Python command, and that way you don't need to include the Python command when you run your script. If you want to do this, you'll also want to make sure that your script is executable. So on Linux, this would be chmod or change mode, adding execute permissions and then the name of the script. And then from there, you can just run the script without needing to specify the interpreter. And then what we'll be using is cells in a Jupyter notebook. So when you type Shift Enter, it will run the Python code. So here's another example. We're using an import statement here to import math, which is part of the Python standard library and provides some data and some functions. So in this case, we're using math.py, which is just the value of pi. We're setting a variable radius equal to 1.0. We'll talk more about variables in the next notebook. We're calculating the area as pi r squared, and then we're printing that to this screen. So this calculates the area of a circle. So the area of a circle with radius 1.0 unit is 3.14159 square units. And so the beauty of using a scripting language is we could just go and change this and run it again. And of course we get a new result based on the calculation with this different radius. So here are some major concepts which we'll be talking about later in this course. Variables are names for data. So we have radius as an example in this cell above. And this can be a simple object like a number or a string of characters, or a character string. Just a string in Python really is what it's called. Or it can be a complex object like a list of values or a dictionary of values. So I'll talk more about lists and dictionaries as well. In Python, we also have statements and operators, which are like the verbs of the language, and they act on data. We have functions, which are used to create reusable blocks of code, classes, which define different types of objects with data and methods or functions. And that'll be something we'll cover later in the course once we've talked more about the earlier information. And then we also have modules, which are entire files of Python code with variables, functions, and classes. And so I hope you'll learn a lot in this course. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Thanks.